My name is Rachel Foster. I am 41 years old, and until a few nights ago, I believed I had finally anchored my life to a safe harbor. Not a mansion, not endless vacations, just that steady, predictable rhythm where the mortgage was paid, the fridge was full, and the storm of my past was finally locked outside. My 1-2-year-old daughter, Chloe, was fast asleep down the hall, and the suffocating panic that used to choke me during my 20s had finally learned to stay quiet. 3 hours before my entire reality shattered, I was sitting at our chipped mahogany dining table, sipping a lukewarm mug of peppermint tea and balancing the monthly spreadsheets. The house was dead silent, illuminated only by the harsh white glare of my laptop and the distant hum of the AC unit. It was the very picture of mundane perfection. Then, my phone started to vibrate against the glass coaster. One sharp buzz, then another, multiplying into an aggressive, relentless swarm of notifications. Before I tell you what I saw on that screen, please hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments if you've ever experienced. A gut-wrenching is less than B is greater than betrayal, is less than B is greater than. That felt like it was ripped straight out of one of those wild, is less than B is greater than Reddit stories is less than B is greater than. I read every single one. At first, I assumed it was a server glitch, but as the lock screen flooded with alerts, a block of ice formed in my chest. I swiped open my banking app, the little loading wheel spun, and the ground simply vanished beneath my feet. My checking account, $2,150. My savings, the $68,400 I had bled and sweated to scrape together over 8. The is less than B is greater than emergency fund is less than B is greater than for Chloe's braces and future tuition? Wiped out. The transfers weren't chaotic or random. They were meticulously executed, fully authorized. I stared at the device ID attached to the withdrawals, and my breath hitched. It wasn't some anonymous syndicate halfway across the globe. It was blood. It was my sister, Brenda. She had been listed on my account since I was a terrified, is less than B, is greater than single mom is less than, B is greater than at 23, desperately needing a guarantor to rent a tiny, moldy apartment. I had completely forgotten her name was still on the paperwork. Now, I was watching nearly 2 decades of sacrifice evaporate into the digital ether. I didn't cry. I wasn't even, is less than B, is greater than screaming, is less than, B is greater than. The sheer magnitude of seeing my is less than B is greater than savings, gone is less than B is greater than, and staring at my is less than B is greater than. Drained accounts is less than B is greater than. Triggered a primal paralysis. My brain slipped into that cold, detached survival mode where you just start making a mental checklist of what is left. And right at that exact second, the screen flashed again. It was my is less than B, is greater than sister. Calling is less than B, is greater than. I didn't answer the call. The sheer weight of this is less than B is greater than betrayal is less than AB is greater, then anchored me to my dining chair, leaving me entirely numb. My brain frantically tried to assess the damage. What else was compromised? What could still be salvaged? I kept refreshing the glowing screen of my banking app, praying my exhausted eyes had just misplaced a decimal point. A system error. Anything. But the numbers remained stubbornly, cruelly zero. Behind me, the faint squeak of bare feet against the hardwood floor broke the silence. My 12-year-old daughter, Chloe, stood in the doorway. She was wearing her baggy sleep shirt, her dark hair, a messy tangle of bedhead, rubbing the exhaustion from her eyes. She looked from my ashen face to the vibrating phone on the table, then back to me. She didn't ask what was wrong. She just stared with a heavy, knowing intensity that felt far too old for a middle schooler. Finally, she squared her narrow shoulders, took a deep breath, and said something that completely short-circuited my brain. "Mom," she whispered softly, "don't panic. I handled it." My heart hammered wildly against my ribs. I turned to her, bewildered, drained, and suddenly terrified for an entirely different reason. There was absolutely nothing a child should have been managing at 2 a.m. Yet, the steady certainty in her voice made the air in the room feel incredibly thin. "What do you mean you handled it, sweetie?" I asked, forcing a gentle calm I absolutely did not feel into my trembling voice. She climbed onto the chair beside me, pulling her knees tight to her chest. "I did exactly what you taught me. When something feels super wrong, you don't wait around. You hit the panic button. That was when my eyes finally caught the bright red banner pulsing at the top of my app, a glaring detail I had completely glossed over in my blind shock. Asterisk, emergency freeze activated. Unusual transaction pending review. Asterisk. My little girl hadn't just witnessed the theft, she had actively intercepted it. For a fleeting second, the kitchen felt suffocatingly small, as if the walls were physically leaning in to eavesdrop on our nightmare. My eyes stayed glued to that thin line of text. The massive withdrawals sat there, paralyzed in a digital purgatory, caught halfway between stolen and secured. You froze the accounts? I choked out. Chloe looked at me like the answer was the most obvious thing in the world. Yeah. You always said the red shield icon is for emergencies. The relief that washed over me wasn't the clean, cinematic kind you see in movies. It was messy, churning with nausea, and a sharp, biting pang of guilt. I worked as an administrative coordinator. I spent my entire week managing permissions, firewalls, and security protocols, and yet my own kid had reacted faster to this is less than B is greater, than bank fraud is less than B is greater than I did. How did you even know it was Aunt Brenda? I asked, still trying to process it all. Chloe reached for her tablet, which she had quietly slid onto the table. Because of the tracking map, she stated simply. Remember when we set up location sharing for that amusement park trip last summer? You never disabled it. I stared blankly at the screen she pushed toward my hands. When the massive withdrawal notification popped up on her iPad because I had left her logged in to manage her weekly chore allowance, she immediately checked the family map. Aunt Brenda's dot wasn't at her condo. It was bouncing around at a rundown roadside motel 45 miles out of town. You weren't there, Chloe explained, her voice remarkably casual, almost bored, as if she were solving a basic math equation. So, I figured it was a bad situation. That was the exact moment the lingering fear crystallized into a cold, hardened fury. Brenda hadn't just attempted to drain my livelihood. She had done it fully aware that I was a mother providing for a child. She had weaponized the access I gave her when I was a struggling. Is less than B, is greater than single mom is less than B, is greater than just trying to keep a roof over our heads, using it to rob her own niece's future. Are we going to be okay? Chloe asked quietly, breaking the silence. That innocent question landed harder than anything else that night. We are going to be perfectly fine, I said, needing the words to sound like an undeniable fact. She tried to take everything, but she didn't win. I pulled her into a tight embrace, breathing in the scent of her vanilla shampoo, but my mind was already racing miles ahead. Brenda had my passwords, my financial history, and my blind trust. Society always tells you to just walk away from A is less than B, is greater than toxic family is less than B is greater than dynamic. Like it's as easy as closing a door. They never warn you about the nightmare that unfolds when those same people hold the master keys to your entire digital existence. 2 days later, my phone lit up with an unknown number while I was on a video call with my coworker, Jessica. We were meticulously combing through the suspicious activity logs, cementing what I already knew in my bones. The device fingerprint matched Brenda's old Android phone perfectly, the exact same model, the same careless login patterns. Chloe sat quietly at the far end of the dining table with her art supplies, sketching what looked like female superheroes, physically tossing a cartoon villain out of a vault. The phone vibrated again, flashing an out-of-state area code. I immediately muted my microphone. Hold on a second, I whispered to Jessica, and hit answer. What the hell did you do? Brenda's voice exploded through the tiny speaker. No hello, no fake apologies, just pure, unadulterated panic and rage colliding all at once. You froze the entire system. Do you have any idea what you've just done? Her voice used to make me shrink, used to make me feel small and inadequate. But that afternoon, sitting in my kitchen with my daughter nearby, it didn't. Good to hear from you too, I replied, my voice eerily calm. How's the weather out at that cheap motel? She cursed loudly, her breathing ragged and heavy. Don't play stupid with me. The bank is hounding my phone. A massive fraud investigation. You had absolutely no right to do that. You're just a glorified administrative coordinator. You don't understand how any of this works. I glanced over at Chloe. She had stopped coloring and gone completely still, her small hands resting on the table. You tried to steal from my child, I said, my tone dropping an octave. And you're the one who's furious? Brenda let out a sharp, ugly laugh that sounded more like a bark. You seriously think this ends with a frozen account? You just threw a massive wrench into things for people who absolutely despise delays. You unfreeze those funds right now. Who exactly are they? I asked, gripping the edge of the table. You don't need to know, she snapped back instantly. You just need to fix this mess, unless you want real trouble showing up at your front door. The threats settled into the room like a thick, suffocating smoke. They weren't loud, they weren't overly dramatic, but they were heavy enough to make every breath feel like a deliberate, painful effort. Old, ingrained instincts tried to wake up inside of me, the ones that always smoothed things over, the ones that apologized first to keep the peace, no matter the personal cost. But something fundamental had shifted. Maybe it was the subtle, terrified crack in Brenda's voice. Or maybe it was the simple fact that Chloe was sitting close enough to hear her own name if this conversation escalated any further. You don't get to terrify me into bailing you out, I stated firmly. Not after what you just tried to pull. Oh, you think you're so brave now? Brenda practically spat through the phone. Just because you hit a panic button? You're an admin, Rachel. You push paperwork around. You don't run anything. You have absolutely no concept of who you just dragged into this mess. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. The silence on my end was louder than her screaming. And you have absolutely no idea how much hard evidence you just handed me on a silver platter, I replied evenly. There was a sudden, chilling pause on the line. A very small one, but it was undeniably there. Don't get smart with me, she hissed, her tone dropping into a venomous whisper. You think freezing that money makes you safe? It just makes you a problem, and problems always get handled. That was more than enough. I ended the call without another single word, my hands visibly shaking as I unmuted my laptop. Jessica's face filled the screen, her expression tight and deeply concerned. I caught most of that, she said quietly. I am so incredibly sorry. Don't be, I replied, staring at the black screen of my phone. She just admitted to way more than she ever intended to. We spent the entirety of the next hour meticulously documenting every single detail. Timestamps, device fingerprints, exact wording from the call. Everything that Jessica, in her calm and professional tone, walked me through as a crucial preservation step. Chloe remained completely silent, drawing with such an intense, unwavering focus that it almost looked as if she were anchoring herself to the wooden table to keep from floating away in the chaos. That night, after Chloe finally drifted off to sleep, tightly clutching her worn-out stuffed bear, I sat utterly alone in the kitchen. I replayed Brenda's exact words over and over in my head. Asterisk, people, delays, handled. Asterisk. Those weren't the desperate, fragmented phrases of someone simply stealing out of sudden financial ruin. Those were the calculated, chilling words of someone deeply embedded within something far larger and much more dangerous. By the next morning, the bank officially confirmed what I had been praying for. The massive frozen transfers had not cleared. The money wasn't safely back in my possession yet, but it wasn't permanently gone either. The recipient account was flagged and under review. A temporary, agonizing chokehold in whatever illicit pipeline Brenda had been utilizing. That same afternoon, an email pinged in my inbox from an address I completely didn't recognize. No formal greeting, no signature block, just a single, terrifying sentence. Asterisk. Family business is best handled quietly. Asterisk. Directly beneath that sentence was a hyperlink. I didn't click it immediately. Instead, I hovered my cursor over it, tracing where it actually led. It was a public forum, one I had only briefly seen in passing years ago, a dark corner of the internet where people traded what they called shortcuts, but were really just elaborate scams dressed up in cleaner, professional language. I cautiously opened the link in a secure sandbox environment and instantly felt my stomach drop straight through the floorboards. A thread pinned right at the top prominently featured my first name in the title. Inside that thread were clear screenshots of my professional LinkedIn profile, a cropped, smiling photo of me and Chloe at a recent school bake sale, and a terrifying stream of comments speculating about my personal pressure points. They were calculating exactly how long it would take before a stressed-out mother finally cracked under the weight of a massive is less than B, is greater than bank fraud is less than B, is greater than investigation. One specific comment casually suggested involving the kid. I slammed the laptop shut so violently that the screen went completely black before my shaking hands even fully registered the motion. The old floorboards creaked softly behind me. "You're still working?" Chloe asked softly from the hallway, rubbing her eyes. I forced a tight, unnatural smile that felt entirely too big for my trembling face. "Just finishing up a few things, sweetie. Go back to bed." She hesitated for a long second, then nodded slowly and padded back down the hall. The bedroom door clicked shut, and I sat there in the suffocating dark, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, finally, truly understanding exactly what Brenda meant. This was no longer just about the money. This was about absolute control and terror. I didn't sleep a single minute that night. Every minor sound outside our small apartment felt magnified 100 times over. A car door slamming down the street, a muffled voice echoing in the hallway, the sudden, harsh glare of my phone lighting up on the table. When morning finally broke, it felt far less like waking up and much more like violently resurfacing from deep water. Jessica called me before I even had the chance to pour my first cup of coffee. I immediately told her about the forum, about the terrifying screenshots, and about that one specific comment that dared to mention my child. She went completely quiet in that very specific way people do when their mind abruptly switches from offering comfort to executing action. "You need to talk to someone official right now," she stated firmly. "Not the bank's customer service, not regular support." This crossed the line into serious financial crimes the exact second they started weaponizing your identity and threatening your family. By noon that exact same day, Jessica had seamlessly looped me into a secure video call with a seasoned woman from the State Cyber Task Force, Detective Hayes. She possessed an incredibly calm voice but possessed sharp, calculating eyes, the kind of intense presence that immediately made you feel completely seen and meticulously measured all at the exact same time. "First thing right off the bat," Detective Hayes stated, her tone unwavering, "you completely stop responding to them. No texts, no angry calls, absolutely no warnings. You document every single interaction and let us clearly see the patterns." She went on to explain to me that this nightmare wasn't actually rare at all, that massive fraud often begins quietly as simple borrowing, and that long-term family access is consistently one of the most heavily abused vectors her unit sees. Hearing those words from a professional didn't magically make the betrayal hurt any less, but it did finally drain some of the suffocating shame right out of my chest. That evening, Chloe sat quietly at the dining table, meticulously coloring in her sketchbook while I frantically scanned through all my old devices. I was aggressively changing passwords, enabling two-factor authentication, and locking down absolutely anything Brenda had ever even briefly touched. I stumbled across old digital notes she'd left for me years ago. Little, seemingly innocent reminders, password hints, undeniable proof of exactly how long this trap had been quietly, patiently set up. "Mom," Chloe said suddenly, breaking my intense concentration. "Are we still doing the fundraiser thing?" I slowly looked up from my glowing screen. The whole idea had been entirely hers. A small, community art sale with her middle school classmates, a productive way to feel like we were actively doing something positive instead of just helplessly waiting for the next blow to land. "Yes," I said softly, forcing a reassuring smile. "We absolutely are." She smiled back, visibly relieved, then hesitated for a long moment. "If Aunt Brenda is doing really bad stuff right now, does that mean she was always a bad person?" I thought back to the Brenda I grew up with. The fiercely protective older sister who used to defend me from bullies, the one who physically helped me move into my first apartment when I had absolutely nothing to my name but a fussy baby and a stained mattress. "People change, sweetie," I said carefully, choosing my words. "And sometimes they just choose the wrong path." Chloe nodded slowly, absorbing that heavy truth in her quiet, thoughtful way. The very next day, another message buzzed in. This one was shorter, much angrier. Asterisk, "Call me right now. You're making this infinitely worse for yourself." Asterisk, I completely ignored it. That afternoon, as we arrived at the busy community center where parents and kids were actively planning the upcoming fundraiser, a tall man unexpectedly stepped out from the deep shade near the edge of the parking lot. He immediately raised his hand slightly in a placating gesture when he saw my entire body tense up in sheer panic. "Rachel," he said quickly, his voice tight. "I'm not here to scare you, I swear." His name was David Vance. I instantly recognized his face from several old photos. Brenda had once proudly shown me years ago, a former close friend of hers, someone who had supposedly gone. "I think they're going to push really hard soon," he said, speaking rapidly, glancing over his shoulder. "Your sister and her husband Greg, and the dangerous people standing right behind them. You freezing that massive amount of money jammed up more than just one single flow." I immediately turned and told Chloe to wait inside the locked car and not open the doors for anyone. Then, I turned back and looked David Vance straight in the eye, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm. "Why are you telling me this?" I demanded. "Because there's a kid involved now," he said, his voice dropping. "And because I'm about to become a father myself next month, I can't pretend this is harmless family drama anymore." That was the exact moment everything fundamentally shifted in my mind. This wasn't just desperate damage control anymore. This was a full-blown criminal case. That same evening, the four of us found ourselves closely connected on a secure video screen. Me, sitting rigidly at my scratched dining table. Jessica, hunched in her immaculate home office, practically barricaded by glowing monitors. Detective Hayes, in a stark, cramped room lined completely with overflowing evidence boxes. And David Vance, sitting stiffly on his worn-out living room couch, the harsh, flickering glow of his television casting nervous, jumping shadows on the peeling wallpaper behind his head. He spoke incredibly fast at first, stumbling over his words as if he were genuinely terrified someone might suddenly cut the connection. He laid out the entire intricate web, encrypted group chats, burner apps, and highly sophisticated fake investment pitches. He detailed exactly how my sister Brenda and her husband Greg had heavily leaned on my professional job title to make their operations sound completely legitimate to unsuspecting victims. How simply being an administrative coordinator made me appear harmless, perfectly trustworthy, and beautifully invisible in exactly the right way. Detective Hayes listened intently without ever interrupting his frantic flow, only offering a sharp, single nod when a piece of the puzzle finally clicked into its proper place. "We can definitely work with this," she stated firmly when he finally paused for breath. "But it completely relies on you cooperating fully, and it means we absolutely control all the next steps." David Vance swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I'm in." When the tense call finally ended, the apartment felt unnaturally, suffocatingly quiet. Chloe quietly wandered in, her dark hair still damp from her evening shower, tightly hugging her favorite stuffed bear against her chest. "Is it all over?" she asked softly. "Not yet, sweetie," I said, offering a small, tired smile. "But we're definitely not fighting this entirely alone anymore." Her small face brightened just a fraction. "Like a real team. Exactly like a team." She sat down heavily beside me and proudly opened her spiral notebook, slowly flipping through several pages completely filled with precise dates, intricate little drawings, and meticulous notes. "I made a detailed list," she announced proudly. "Every single time Aunt Brenda helped with your phone or fixed your computer, every single app she ever touched." I stared blankly at the lined pages. Somewhere between finishing her math homework and reading her graphic novels, my incredibly observant daughter had quietly launched her very own internal is less than B, is greater than police investigation is less than B, is greater than. "These are vital data points," I said softly, genuinely impressed. Over the incredibly tense next few days, Detective Hayes' specialized team meticulously built a foolproof plan. They desperately needed Brenda to openly talk, to willingly admit exactly what that massive sum of money was specifically intended for, and to explicitly acknowledge the larger, far more dangerous operation she was wrapped up in. The glaring problem was that she already deeply suspected I was onto her. We absolutely needed her to firmly believe I was completely terrified and desperate to back down. That specific part was surprisingly easy to fake. I called Brenda directly, with Detective Hayes silently listening in on the secure line. I intentionally let my voice shake with fear. I tearfully told her I couldn't sleep at all, that terrifying messages were constantly coming in, and that I was genuinely afraid for Chloe's safety. Her aggressive tone shifted almost immediately, becoming instantly smug and deeply reassured. "I told you," she practically purred. "You absolutely don't belong in this world. You're just a glorified administrative coordinator desperately trying to play high-stakes grown-up games." I just desperately want this all to stop, I pleaded, letting a sob catch in my throat. They said if I just sign off on some release forms, it can all completely go away. There was a long, heavy pause on the line, a palpable silence where pure, unadulterated greed was violently wrestling with basic caution. Where? She finally demanded. I named a bustling, highly public location, incredibly busy, highly visible, with security cameras positioned absolutely everywhere. Fine, she snapped. But don't try anything stupid, Rachel. When the call finally ended, I sat completely still, staring blankly at my pale reflection in the dark, silent screen of my laptop. My hands were visibly shaking from the adrenaline, but my mind was incredibly, sharply clear. The trap was perfectly set. The very next day felt entirely surreal. In exactly that specific, sharp way only deep fear meticulously sharpened by an undeniable purpose can ever truly feel. The sky above was brilliantly, almost cruelly normal. I quietly dropped Chloe off with Jessica early that morning, under the flimsy excuse of a long, intensive study day, kissed her warm forehead a fraction longer than usual, and softly promised her I would see her very soon. She didn't ask a single question. She just tightly squeezed my hand and nodded slowly, looking exactly like she understood far more than she ever let on. At the sprawling city park, the crisp morning air smelled strongly like freshly cut grass and still water from the nearby fountain. Casual joggers effortlessly passed by. Young couples laughed loudly on blankets. A brightly colored food truck hummed steadily in the far distance. Every single detail about the sprawling place screamed Time's Safe Zone *, which was exactly why Detective Hayes had specifically chosen it for this high-stakes encounter. Hidden completely under my oversized sweatshirt, the tiny wire pressed uncomfortably warm against my bare skin. I could vividly feel its hard edge every single time I took a shallow breath. Somewhere very nearby, plainclothes officers seamlessly blended into the bustling crowd. David Vance sat completely stiffly on a worn wooden bench half a block away, intensely pretending to scroll aimlessly through his phone, his jaw locked tight. "She's getting very close," Detective Hayes's calm, steady voice murmured directly into my tiny earpiece. I immediately spotted Brenda long before she ever saw me standing there. She looked noticeably thinner, much sharper around the edges, almost brittle. Her dark eyes kept darting nervously, constantly scanning random faces, looking for easy exits, intensely checking reflections in the glass of passing cars. Walking closely beside her was her husband, Greg, looking far taller than I actually remembered, his large hands shoved deeply into his jacket pockets, exactly like a man desperately trying to hold his completely shattered nerves together. "You look absolutely terrible," Brenda said flatly the exact second they finally reached me. No warm hello, absolutely no genuine concern. "So do you," I replied evenly, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. She loudly snorted in sheer disgust. "Let's just get this nightmare completely over with right now." I slowly pulled out the thick manila folder Detective Hayes had meticulously prepared for me, heavy with incredibly convincing fake paperwork. Forged bank release letters, official-looking forms that easily looked legitimate enough to pass a quick, nervous glance. Brenda aggressively snatched them and impatiently flipped through the thick stack. "You really, truly screwed things up this time," Greg said quietly, his voice tight. "You actually know that, right?" "I know for a fact you illegally used my personal accounts," I stated clearly, making sure the hidden microphone caught every word, and my entire name. Brenda dramatically rolled her eyes. "Oh, please spare me the drama. You were never even using those accounts anyway. You're just a low-level administrative coordinator. You barely ever touch real money." Those cruel words stung far more than I ever expected them to, even though I had fully anticipated them. "I need to clearly hear you say it out loud," I demanded, desperately keeping my trembling voice completely steady. "Exactly what you were doing with all of it?" She aggressively leaned much closer, sharply lowering her voice to a harsh whisper. "We were simply moving large funds around. That's literally it, just borrowing some temporary momentum." "You deliberately left the door wide open for massive scams," I pushed back hard. Her cruel smile faltered slightly. "For highly lucrative opportunities." Greg nervously shifted his weight beside her. "Don't say too much right now," he muttered under his breath. Brenda immediately shot him a venomous look. "Just relax. She's completely terrified. She won't actually do anything. That was exactly when another sharp voice unexpectedly cut right into the tense conversation. She absolutely deserved to know the truth. We all violently turned around. A woman stood just a few steps away, her arms tightly crossed over her chest, her eyes rimmed bright red with sheer exhaustion. It was David Vance's pregnant wife. A woman who looked exactly like she had finally reached the absolute end of her endless justifications. "You completely lied to us." She practically spat directly at Brenda. "You explicitly said this was totally clean. You never once mentioned there was a little kid involved." Brenda's sharp face instantly hardened into stone. "Don't you dare do this right now." "I'm completely done doing absolutely anything for you," the woman snapped back furiously. "They're actively watching you right now, all those dangerous people in those encrypted chats, and they are definitely not patient." Brenda's hand shot out violently, aggressively grabbing the woman's arm. "That was exactly enough. Step back immediately." Detective Hayes's voice echoed calmly but forcefully in my ear. I quickly took 2 massive steps backward, exactly as heavily armed officers rapidly moved in from every single direction. Silver badges flashed brightly in the sun, loud voices rose sharply above the park noise. Brenda frantically tried to pull herself free, screaming. Greg completely froze in sheer terror. The pregnant woman started sobbing uncontrollably. As Brenda was forcefully cuffed, her wild eyes finally locked onto mine. "You actually did this," she gasped, complete disbelief, finally breaking through the sheer anger. "No," I said quietly, my voice perfectly steady. "You did." She let out a blood-curdling scream as they forcefully led her away. Not coherent words, just pure, animalistic sound. And in that exact moment, I finally knew with absolute certainty that absolutely nothing would ever go back to exactly how it was before. The haunting echo of Brenda is less than, B is greater than, screaming is less than, B is greater than followed me long after the sprawling park had emptied back into its mundane, everyday rhythm. It violently reverberated in my ears while the lead is less than, B is greater than, detective is less than, B is greater than, Hayes methodically walked me through the grueling next steps, and while a plainclothes officer carefully peeled the warm recording wire from my skin. David Vance sat on a nearby bench with his head buried in his hands, looking exactly like he had aged 10 years in a matter of minutes. I didn't feel victorious. This wasn't some satisfying is less than, B is greater than revenge story is less than, B is greater than where the hero walks away smiling. I just felt incredibly, deeply hollow. That evening, Jessica drove Chloe back to our apartment. My daughter climbed out of the back seat slowly, searching my exhausted face the exact way she always did when she sensed a massive shift in our universe. I knelt down on the pavement before she could even ask anything. "She can't hurt us anymore," I whispered. Chloe nodded, absorbing the heavy truth. "Is she going to jail?" "Yes," I said. "For a long time." She thought about that, then asked the one question I had been dreading. "Is that why she was yelling?" I exhaled slowly. Sometimes, when people finally face real consequences, the very first thing they feel isn't regret, it's just pure shock. Chloe seemed to accept that. She went inside, sat at the dining table, and pulled out her sketchbook in complete silence, processing what adults constantly struggled to say out loud. The weeks that immediately followed the sting operation were suffocatingly heavy and agonizingly slow. Endless official statements, grueling depositions, and legal phone calls that always seemed to ring either too early in the morning or far too late at night. The sweeping is less than, B is greater than, police investigation is less than, B is greater than, officially uncovered, far more victims than my stomach could handle thinking about. Vulnerable retirees, single parents, trusting people who had unfortunately bought into the wrong pitch at exactly the wrong moment. At the preliminary is less than, B is greater than, court hearing is less than, B is greater than. Brenda deliberately avoided my eyes entirely. Greg, however, did not. His stare was incredibly sharp and deeply resentful, as if I had maliciously stolen something from him instead of the other way around. We eventually had to file a strict is less than, B is greater than restraining order, is less than, B is greater than, just to ensure he couldn't approach our home. David Vance sat quietly 2 rows back, his broad shoulders completely tense, his hand resting protectively on his pregnant wife's knee. When the Great Two, when the severe charges were finally read aloud, conspiracy, wire fraud, and massive is less than, B is greater than, identity theft is less than, A, B is greater than, something tight inside my chest finally settled. It wasn't exactly peace, but it was absolute certainty. The protective version of my sister I used to fiercely defend no longer existed. This was the person she had actively chosen to become. Months later, a comprehensive plea deal was formally signed. A harsh sentence meticulously measured in years, not empty apologies. It felt like is less than, B is greater than, justice served is less than, B is greater than, but the emotional toll remained heavy. The bank eventually agreed to quietly cover a significant portion of the financial losses, carefully sweeping the mess under the rug as massive institutions always do when they desperately want bad press to fade. It wasn't everything, but it was just enough to keep our fragile lives entirely intact. The quiet afternoon, the official letter arrived confirming the funds were restored. Chloe watched me read it from across the table. Her small fingers nervously twisted the hem of her shirt. "So," she asked softly, "are we totally safe now?" I carefully folded the crisp paper and met her hopeful eyes. "We're safer." That became our brand new baseline goal. Safety, not blind trust, not pretending that A is less than B is greater than toxic family is less than B is greater than member couldn't completely destroy you. Real safety, meticulously and deliberately built from scratch. We implemented aggressive credit freezes, mandatory two-factor authentication on everything, absolutely no shared access, with zero exceptions. One quiet night, I found Chloe diligently working on a brand new comic strip. She had beautifully drawn the two of us standing closely together, massive shields held high, our defensive lines incredibly firm. Off to the side, trapped behind heavy iron bars made of complex numbers and security symbols, was a small, defeated figure with their head buried in their hands. "Do you think she'll ever actually say sorry?" Chloe asked, not even looking up from her page. "Maybe," I said honestly. "But we don't ever get to put our lives on hold waiting for that." She nodded firmly and carefully added one final, bold speech bubble to the vibrant page. Asterisk. Boundaries are not mean. They are protection. Asterisk. Life definitely didn't just magically snap back into its perfect place after that. It stretched out incredibly slowly, awkwardly, exactly like a severely torn muscle that was painstakingly learning how to move again without violently tearing all over. There were still massive stacks of legal paperwork piling up right beside Chloe's middle school homework. There were still terrifying nights when I shot awake in a cold sweat, absolutely convinced I had missed some tiny loophole, plagued by nightmares of my is less than B is greater than sister calling is less than B is greater than to finish the job. The lingering trauma of seeing my is less than B is greater than, drained accounts is less than B is greater than, and the sheer panic of having my is less than B is greater than savings, gone is less than B is greater than, didn't just vanish overnight. It was a level of is less than B, is greater than betrayal, is less than B is greater than. That felt like reading one of those unbelievable is less than B is greater than. Reddit stories is less than, B is greater than, except it was my actual life. But as a dedicated is less than B is greater than, single mom is less than B is greater than, I knew I had to keep moving forward. We slowly began rebuilding our sacred is less than B is greater, then emergency fund is less than B is greater than, dollar by dollar. And slowly, there were also mornings that started to feel genuinely lighter. Chloe's planned school fundraiser finally went forward exactly as scheduled. What initially started as a tiny, modest art sale completely transformed into a tightly packed room at the bustling community center. The bright walls were proudly covered in vibrant crayon drawings and detailed digital prints, with curious parents lingering far longer than anyone had originally anticipated. Chloe stood confidently at the very front of the room with a massive poster board she had meticulously crafted herself. It prominently featured a brightly colored piggy bank wearing a superhero cape, with a sturdy brass lock drawn exactly like a wide, reassuring smile. "This is fundamentally about safe money," she clearly explained to the gathered crowd of adults without a single ounce of hesitation. "And danger money, and exactly how kids notice really important things when grown-ups are just too tired to see them." A few scattered parents chuckled softly, but a significant majority did not. More than one deeply concerned mother pulled me aside afterward to quietly ask probing questions about the hidden dangers of shared financial accounts, about the casual habit of letting older relatives fix their personal phones, and about incredibly basic security measures they had simply never thought twice about. That was exactly how I unexpectedly ended up standing nervously in front of a packed room exactly 1 week later, delivering a short, highly impactful presentation I had absolutely never planned to give. I completely avoided using dense technical jargon. I actively tried not to terrify anyone with worst-case scenarios. I just stood there and honestly told them the unvarnished truth. That blind trust completely devoid of firm boundaries is absolutely not an act of kindness. That unfettered digital access is a massive form of power, even when it looks incredibly small and insignificant on the surface. That simply being a mid-level administrative coordinator absolutely did not make me magically immune to catastrophic harm, and it certainly did not make my own sister's devastating actions any less significant. People genuinely listened. Back at home, Chloe and I actively made crucial changes together. We consciously turned digital security into something empowering and shared, instead of something isolating and scary. She enthusiastically helped me label our new encrypted hard drives. She constantly asked insightful questions about firewalls. She meticulously maintained her spiral notebook of what she called bad feeling apps, carefully marking the suspicious ones we permanently deleted with tiny, bright red warning symbols. One quiet evening, several long months after the final sentencing was handed down, I found her sitting at the dining table, intensely focused on drawing another detailed comic strip. This specific one simply showed a bold, thick black line drawn cleanly across the center of the crisp white page. On the left side was the chaotic past, and on the right side was absolutely everything that came after. "What exactly are you calling this one?" I asked softly, peering over her shoulder. She smiled warmly. "Before and after." Much later that same night, when the small apartment was completely silent, I slowly scrolled through the massive archive of old digital photos on my phone. Brenda and me awkwardly posing as teenagers. Brenda gently holding Chloe when she was just a fragile newborn, looking simultaneously terrified and incredibly proud. I consciously decided not to delete a single one of them. Pretending those genuinely happy moments never actually happened wouldn't magically protect us from the pain. It would just be a cowardly attempt to rewrite our own history. Instead, I carefully created a brand new digital album. I explicitly named it Before. Absolutely everything else went directly into After. I had learned a brutal, invaluable lesson that I desperately wish I had fully understood much earlier in my life. Family is absolutely not a guaranteed firewall. Unconditional love does not automatically secure your bank accounts or your peace of mind. Sometimes, the absolute most dangerous vulnerabilities in your entire life are the exact ones you constantly excuse simply because they feel incredibly familiar and deeply ingrained. And sometimes, the absolute bravest thing you can ever possibly do is to completely stop pretending that unchecked access automatically equals unwavering loyalty. That was the profound lesson I consciously carried forward, quietly and deliberately. Every single time I actively chose my own safety over the paralyzing fear dressed up as familial obligation. There were definitely still fleeting moments when a sharp pang of guilt crept in, completely uninvited and surprisingly sharp. Like standing frozen in the middle of the grocery store, staring blankly at the exact brand of coffee Brenda used to constantly joke about, or during those quiet family holidays when my phone stubbornly stayed silent instead of buzzing constantly with forced, chaotic cheer. Completely cutting someone out of your life doesn't magically erase them from your memory. It just fundamentally changes the specific shape of their lingering absence. People constantly asked probing questions, some incredibly carefully, others with heavy judgment thinly veiled behind fake concern. Asterisk, how could you possibly do that to your own flesh and blood? Don't you honestly think sending her to jail is a bit extreme? Family is always family, no matter what. Asterisk, I learned incredibly quickly exactly who was genuinely listening to my honest answers and who was merely waiting for me to finish speaking just to confirm what they already stubbornly believed. Chloe, however, handled the entire situation entirely differently. Kids simply don't romanticize deep emotional harm the exact way adults constantly do. One sunny afternoon, as we slowly walked home from her middle school, she casually kicked a pebble and said, "I honestly think some people really don't like boundaries simply because they don't personally benefit from them anymore." I completely stopped walking. She took 2 more steps, then turned back, looking genuinely confused. "What?" she asked innocently. "Nothing, sweetie," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. That was just incredibly, perfectly accurate. At my office, the overall atmosphere fundamentally shifted, too. The shocking news had spread quietly at first. Not the gritty, intimate details, just exactly enough of the broad strokes. My coworkers proactively started double-checking their own digital permissions, actively asking critical questions before blindly sharing administrative access. I was definitely still just an administrative coordinator, still diligently processing routine tickets and meticulously cleaning up small, everyday messes. But now, when I confidently spoke up in meetings, people actively listened in an entirely different way, not because my official job title had magically changed, but simply because my personal story carried massive, undeniable weight. Detective Hayes still checked in periodically. Always short, concise updates, maintaining a perfectly professional distance. Brenda and Greg's sprawling criminal case had rapidly expanded outward, directly touching the lives of dozens of vulnerable people I would absolutely never meet. Countless illicit accounts were permanently frozen, and the severe federal charges rapidly stacked up. The incredibly dark web she had so casually stepped into was infinitely wider and far more dangerous than I had ever possibly imagined, and simply pulling that one single thread had violently unraveled so much more than just my own quiet life. David Vance completely kept his given word. He bravely testified in open court. He permanently disappeared from those shady online forums. He sent me exactly one final message several months later, just a beautiful, simple photo of a tiny newborn baby tightly wrapped in a striped hospital blanket, accompanied by a profoundly simple Times thank you asterisk. I deliberately didn't reply to it. Some incredibly heavy chapters in life simply don't require any further responses. One quiet, rainy night, long after the chaotic noise of the trial had finally faded into the background, Chloe and I sat comfortably on the worn living room couch, mindlessly watching something entirely forgettable on the television. She heavily leaned against my side, feeling incredibly warm and solid, and softly said, "I'm really glad you didn't unfreeze that money for her." "So am I, sweetie," I replied softly. "Even though she's technically family," Chloe added thoughtfully. "Especially because she's family," I corrected gently. She nodded slowly, looking completely satisfied with that answer, and comfortably rested her heavy head directly on my shoulder. That was the exact moment I finally, truly realized that this entire grueling ordeal wasn't actually a story about a devastating betrayal anymore. It was fundamentally about the incredibly firm line we bravely drew immediately afterward, the specific line that clearly stated, asterisk this far, and absolutely no further. Asterisk. The critical line that permanently taught my young daughter that genuine love absolutely does not require total self-destruction. That simply being a kind person does not inherently mean you have to remain completely unprotected. I used to honestly think that personal boundaries were exactly like massive stone walls, cold, isolating, and incredibly final. Now, I knew significantly better. They were actually sturdy guardrails. Something you deliberately and carefully put into place, not to aggressively keep other people out, but to safely keep yourself from accidentally falling down into a dark place you could absolutely never climb back up from. And every single day after that profound realization, I consciously chose to firmly hold that protective line, quietly and without a single ounce of apology. One quiet evening, many months after everything had finally settled into something closely resembling a normal routine, we sat comfortably together on the living room couch. The apartment was peacefully dim, illuminated only by the warm, soft amber light of a reading lamp. Chloe leaned heavily against my shoulder, idly scrolling through her vibrant digital drawings on her tablet. "Mom," she whispered softly, not even looking up from the glowing screen. "Do you honestly think families can completely break apart and still be real?" I took a deep breath and truly thought about it. I thought about the heavy chains of blood and forced obligation, about toxic silence so often mistakenly praised as loyalty, about exactly how many years I had foolishly believed that unconditional love simply meant quietly allowing myself to be repeatedly hurt. "Yes, sweetie," I finally answered. "I actually think sometimes breaking apart is the absolute only way they ever become genuinely real." She nodded slowly, completely satisfied with that profound truth, and gently set her tablet aside on the coffee table. Much later that same night, long after Chloe was fast asleep in her room, I sat entirely alone at the exact same mahogany dining table where this entire nightmare had originally started. It was the exact same wooden chair, the exact same physical space, but an entirely different, vastly stronger version of me sitting there. I deeply pondered the one terrifying question I had been so desperately afraid to answer at the very beginning of this ordeal. When your own flesh and blood completely turns their back on you, what is the actual enduring lesson? For me, it absolutely wasn't about granting endless, unearned forgiveness. It certainly wasn't about politely pretending that nothing devastating had ever happened. It was ultimately about finding the profound courage to look them in the eye and say, "This is exactly where my story definitively changes, even if yours does not." It was the deep, unwavering understanding that setting firm limits is absolutely not a cruel punishment. It is vital protection. It is the essential dividing line that actively keeps love from slowly rotting into something deeply harmful. It is the quiet, daily decision to consciously choose your own safety over paralyzing fear dressed up as family obligation. I finally reached over, turned off the kitchen light, and walked down the hall to bed knowing something with absolute certainty that I simply hadn't known before. My life wasn't defined or built upon what my sister maliciously took or tried to destroy. It was beautifully and firmly built upon exactly what I bravely chose to protect. If you stayed and listened all the way to the very end of this journey, thank you from the bottom of my heart. It truly means so much more to me than you will ever know. Before we officially wrap up today's episode, please go ahead and hit that like button and share this video if Rachel and Chloe's journey resonated with you or helped you in any way. I truly hope their experience reminded you that you always have the absolute right to fiercely protect your own peace, even from the very people who happen to share your last name. Thank you for tuning in to Karma's Coils. For another compelling journey that perfectly fits your current mood, click the video popping up on the left side of your screen. To hear our absolute latest release, choose the video on the right.